Hey, deserving listeners, the Ultimatum reunion. Let's see what happens.
So what was the turning point? What was the moment it went sideways?
Obviously, as you all know, we had a very tumultuous relationship. It was a roller coaster. There was a lot of ups and downs. You know, it's really hard for me to say it. I was arrested.
Okay, so to catch you up, Mildred and Tiff are disclosing that they are no longer engaged, and after getting engaged on the show, they moved in together. There was some conflict that they were having on the reunion about paying the rent, and Mildred was, I think Mildred is hurt and is angry at Tiff for leaving or something. And then the host asked a great question, when did it go sideways? And I thought, well, we'll probably just get a general story like what we normally hear in cases like this, on shows like this, or in life, where someone says, well, we got in a big fight and Tiff moved out and then I said, I'm done, or something like that. And so I thought we'd hear something like that. But then Mildred reveals that she was arrested, and she is, I don't know, I'm guessing they'll get into it, but I'm guessing that it was intimate partner violence, or at least that's the accusation. So let's hear the rest here.
I threw a picture frame and I broke it, and the glass shattered everywhere. And I threw a peg gate at you, and it was really heavy. At the same time, I was grabbing all of your clothes from the closet and throwing them down the stairs because I really wanted you to leave my home.
So you did throw the dog at me? The police statement.
Wow. Not terribly surprising given the bits and pieces that we saw on the show. Of course, I didn't assume this, but it fits the overall presentation, the volatility, the amount of times they broke up, the issues Mildred exhibited. So that's upsetting. If this is a one-time event, still wrong and criminal. But often, we've all been in fights, so to speak, conflict with our partners, and we've all been hurt and angry. And I can tell you that me and my wife have never even had the impulse to pick up something and throw it at the other person, or even throw it anywhere, right? So that is particular. And when you have that impulse, it generally means that it isn't a one-time thing. So are we going to hear about more incidents? Tiff seems to be approaching this reunion by giving some information and defending themselves, but not necessarily introducing things. I think Tiff just wants it to be over. So and Tiff would be the one that would volunteer more data along those lines. So I don't know. Let's watch.
Finish, Tiff. I need to finish. Okay? Mm-hmm. You don't have that power over me anymore.
What?
Yeah, I threw something at you, and you called the police at me, and they arrested me in my home, and they took my engagement ring off, and I never put it back on. I'm not proud of what I did.
Okay. That's an understatement. I don't think anyone was claiming that you were proud. It'd be a weird thing to be proud of. So, okay. Usually when people say that, it's like, I'm not proud of what I did, but, Tiff really deserved my anger or something. Let's see what she says.
But there was a lot of fighting. There was always screaming, yelling, hitting the walls, punching the walls. Tiff called me a trash mom, degraded me. There was a lot of problems when it came to my son, and I did not feel accepted.
All right. I don't know, and maybe we'll never know, but it's not a good sign. For example, if I, as a non-abusive partner, I'm just going to have to take my word for it, were to have an outburst like that, God forbid, and maybe it's because I'm a therapist and I've literally treated perpetrators, and obviously treated hundreds of victims, but so maybe it's me. But anyway, you would hope that, but I've seen this before. I've actually treated couples who will have, so it's not unheard of for a couple without any abusive history and really no impulses generally along those lines to have a flash fight where there is violence. It's within every human to become violent, and sometimes it does happen, and it doesn't indicate, it's not the tip of the iceberg. And I've treated people like that, and they typically will very quickly, because they're not generally abusive and they don't have it's not a normal thing to them. It's very abnormal. They might initially defend themselves, but very quickly they'll say, particularly if they're arrested, because you have a lot of time to think about what you did. Plus, the fact that Mildred was arrested, we don't know, and certainly a lot of on-site police activity can be confused and problematic, and was racism a part of that? Could be, but often it is at least a data point that on site the investigators determined that Mildred was the perpetrator, at least in that moment. But I will say that there are some people who, again, they have these very rare moments, maybe the only time in their life, and after being defensive, soon after that, they will have a different narrative about it. They'll say, like, look, it was wrong. I don't know what happened. And I could say I had a few drinks and that affected me, but I don't know, something really weird happened. It was totally wrong, and I'm actually scared of myself. People who genuinely have a strange, anomalous behavior like that, it'll terrify them because it's not of their nature and they know it's wrong. That's why they never do it normally. And so they will frame it that way and want help. They'll say, please, I thought I would never do it. How did that happen? Please help me. That's not what Mildred is saying, and that's not what perpetrators typically say, because they have been shown that that's normal, and they might have been shown a lot of other behaviors like denial and claiming that you have a right to do that. And if there is a general pattern there from Mildred, there's a lot of signs that actually line up with this. Of course, I can't know based on this very little information, but the conversations, there's a bit of it here where Mildred will say, stop interrupting me, but in the process will dominate the conversation, basically saying, you, Tiff, cannot talk, framing it as you're interrupting me instead of, and we've seen this before, when just a classic example of verbal emotional abuse was with Amaranth, and you can watch my reaction videos to that, highly triggering, of course, and the perpetrator, alleged perpetrator, the partner, husband, I think, of Amaranth, was like that occasionally. Amaranth would speak up and try to defend herself or say something or even just cry. And from my memory anyway, he was saying, you're interrupting me. You're not letting me finish. Let me finish. You never let me finish. And for these people, sometimes they legit feel that way. It's not a tactic. It's a symptom of their underlying pathology that distorts reality. They think they actually are being put upon. A lot of perpetrators at least will say they're the victim, and a lot of those people who say they're the victim, they believe they're the victim. They're not waking up in the morning and saying, I'm going to trick everyone and I'm going to abuse this person, but I'm going to say that I'm the victim. Because of their distortions, because of their transferences and their displacements and their trauma and what they were taught, they literally believe they're the victim when they are not the victim. So there was that behavior, and there were other kind of indications, but not a lot. But let's see what else we hear.
Hitting the walls, punching the walls. Tiff called me a trash mom, degraded me. There was a lot of problems when it came to my son, and I did not feel accepted as a mother.
What do you mean by that?
I come with a package, and my son will always be first. I will always be.
Yeah, maybe they edited it, but it's fairly strange that would be the paragraph. She's still within the paragraph of, I got arrested for physically abusing, and now we're in a zone of, I'm the victim, and maybe Mildred is a victim. There is such a thing as mutual abuse. People will say that there isn't, and the reason why is because perpetrators will often claim, as I was saying earlier, that they're the victims, and when they are found out as a perpetrator, they either believe or they will use as a tactic, they will say, but my partner hit me, my partner said bad things about me, so we're both to blame, kind of a thing. And they will claim mutual abuse when it is anything but mutual. And is it possible that as a victim, you might become violent at times as a way of defending yourself, or you're just frustrated, you just lose it sometimes because you're very stressed out? Yeah, and in the overall picture, we would never say that victim, having done that, is the abuser, right? Might the victim use verbal abusive language at times? Sure. Does that mean that the victim is also a perpetrator? Not necessarily. Having said that, there are documented cases, and we've known about it in domestic violence treatment, intimate partner violence research for decades, that for some people, given their backgrounds, given their traumas, that each person will take turns-ish victimizing the other person. It is hard to imagine, given rudimentary understanding of victimization and perpetration of high control and of abuse and of coercion and gaslighting. And it's hard to imagine, but it can happen. Typically, they, as a rule, as a couple, it's generally accepted that it's quote unquote not okay to be abusive, but when push comes to shove, it is okay to cross a line. And it's a way that each person expresses themselves. They're trying to communicate. They're trying to show, like, I don't want this to happen anymore, or I don't like what you did, or that sort of thing. And it's not a general pattern of one person controlling the other, the way that a typical perpetrator-victim relationship will be, where the perpetrator breaks the person down, needs to control, is slowly degrading the victim's freedom and sense of self and sense of their own identity, sense of their own sanity. And so that is the classic abuse that we will often talk about. But you can be violent and verbally abusive without necessarily having that overall pattern. It's confusing, but so we don't know. Now, Mildred isn't saying that Tiff was violent with Mildred, so that says something. But I don't know. At the very least, the high level of conflict and you could say toxicity that we were hearing about from the couple is even more severe than we might have originally thought.
Mother first.
Yeah, I did have a problem with connecting with your son, absolutely. I did. I tried. But honestly,
there was a lot of sneaking around. You changed the passcode on your phone.
This has nothing to do with being violent. So it's interesting. And perpetrators will do that. I don't know if Mildred's a perpetrator or would be characterized as such. Certainly legally, that was, at least temporarily, the designation. But this is what perpetrators will do, is they will derail. And as a victim, you will feel like it's a compelling argument, right? The perpetrator knows how to trigger distracting topics and how to put up a smokescreen. So just imagine if Mal, for example, had some event that was violent like that and got arrested. Just imagine what Mal would say. Mal's probably never done that. I'm just going to take a guess. But if Mal did, you just know that the conversation would have been much different, and there wouldn't be this smokescreen, this distraction into it. And might some of this be true? And that's the thing about perpetrators, is they will sometimes even identify true things. Is it true that Tiff had a hard time at times adjusting to being a step-parent? That wouldn't be unusual. Is it true that Tiff went during conflict and while angry and hurt might have said some hurtful things about Mildred's parenting? Yeah, that's possible. It has nothing to do with being violent and throwing things at your partner.
It's okay.
Well, you just did.
Well, I'm judging you for having me take care of some bills and having my
What
things
bills
in
did
the
you
home
take?
that we created while you're out there, sleeping around. There was a week where I got home at 3 a.m, and guess what? Tiff wasn't home. And that's where I found the eyeliner. I don't wear eyeliner.
Makeup
and I don't own.
So all this is irrelevant. And if we just take this topic individually without thinking of the context, does Mildred have a legitimate hurt there? Yeah, I suppose. But it depends on the arrangement they had. It sounds like they broke up but still lived together. It sounds like Tiff might have not been able to afford a place, or maybe there was a transition time where it was hard to navigate that. And so they were still living together, which happens. And at least according to Tiff is saying, look, we're broken up, so it's okay for both of us to date. And Mildred is, focusing on that. And and then Mildred's saying, but I was paying rent. And so, who knows what the arrangement was. Could Tiff be a jerk face around that? Could Mildred is framing it like Tiff forced Mildred to pay for rent, but Mildred isn't identifying the basis for that accusation. Is it possible that Mildred was on the fence about paying rent for Tiff? Is it possible that Tiff might have given the impression, and maybe even legit thought it was going to happen, that Tiff was going to get a better job and start contributing more, and that it didn't work out. Is it possible that Tiff was maybe a little manipulative by claiming that they would pay for more rent? It's all possible. We don't know. There seems to be a lot of accusation going back and forth. What I'm guessing happened is that Tiff and Mildred, they were engaged. They decided to move in together, and Mildred is more established and has maybe a nicer place, a bigger place, and the kid, so that's the thing. And then Tiff moves in, and at first is having trouble coming up with half of the rent, intends on doing it eventually. And Tiff and Mildred proceed to have a lot of fights and a lot of anger and a lot of verbal fighting back and forth and arguing. And then Tiff pretty quickly, there's a lot of stress. It's maybe hard to look for a job under those circumstances. And then at some point, Mildred is violent and gets arrested, and Tiff moves out. And so, Tiff stays or something. And Tiff is like, well, it's really hard to just sit here in the house lonely. And one of the ways to get out of the house and one of the ways to have support and distract myself is to start dating. Tiff starts dating. And Mildred is hurt by that, naturally, which is normal. What do we do with that hurt? And then Mildred gets more angry, more steam. We can imagine that. Given Mildred's abandonment history and the emotions around that, it's understandable. But what do we do with that, right, is the question. Then Mildred proceeds to, maybe Tiff comes home. Mildred is, where were you, this sort of thing. And Tiff's like, get off my back. Then it escalates, and then violence happens, and the police are called. So, I don't know, but it seems like at least somewhere near there wouldn't be surprising.
Eyeliner.
What makeup are you
I don't know who was in my house, and there was just all these sex board games.
Mildred,
That was very painful for
I
me.
got enough of an imagination. I don't need no fucking board
Okay,
games.
this is-
What are you talking about?
I actually have them. They came in the mail because
What?
the leasing office gave them to me.
Yeah, sure. What?
What's the difference? What if Tiff did have a sex board game? Who cares? How is that relevant to anything? It's not relevant to anything. And so either Mildred is completely making stuff up, which is possible, or Tiff is being defensive about things that they don't necessarily have to, because if it is true, Tiff could say, yeah, okay, I ordered some sex. That doesn't mean anything because you were violent with me and the police took you in their custody because you're an abusive human being or something. Now, so I don't know, and I'm guessing we'll never find out, but if Tiff is a legit victim of ongoing abuse from Mildred, which, it's possible, then recovery from the high control relationship takes time. It's very akin to, if not the same, as extracting your personality and your mental sanity when you leave a cult. We all hopefully understand that when someone's indoctrinated into a high control cult, that when they become brainwashed, and when you on a number of domains, depending on the situation, but and then when you finally break free, which is great, then begins the mental extraction. You might physically have extracted yourself from the high control, but then it takes a long time, and that's why you need a specialist to help you deprogram yourself. And what a lot of people will do is they'll say, you're brainwashed, and they'll say, stop it, even if they're trying to help. Or they just don't appreciate the brainwashing and the gaslighting that can happen to people. So it's possible that Tiff is in a transition zone from there and is still in the mindset of that there's some validity to what Mildred is saying, and thus Tiff has to defend themselves. Because if there was abuse, or there was at least even just temporary abuse, then perhaps further down the road, Tiff might say something like, in this moment, okay, well, maybe this stuff is true, maybe it's not. But bottom line is that I am out of the relationship, and you were this and that, and whether or not there was a sex board game or not, it doesn't really matter. And whether or not I criticized your parenting, and if I did, that's wrong, but that doesn't justify what you did to me. To say such a thing, you would have to be completely differentiated, or at least mostly differentiated, and you would have to regain a normal perspective of right and wrong and what's okay in a relationship, And it's possible that Tiff, prior to Mildred, has a history with other kinds of things like this. So, it wouldn't just be extracting yourself from Mildred's dominance and brainwashing, but just a lifetime of it. Now, I want to be clear. Maybe y'all know that Mildred's the victim and Tiff's a complete jerkface, and it was this anomalous violence that Mildred was arrested for. So, yeah, I know enough about these situations to know that I know almost nothing. So maybe we'll get some information, but I'm guessing we won't.
So I will send you pictures. So just so you're screaming to everyone.
What board game is it called,
asking
Mildred? What board game is
I will
even
send
called?
them to you.
A sex board game?
I'm glad you're saying
literally
that.
You're just fucking
because I actually have them in my.
Are you fucking
I actually
kidding?
have them. I don't care what it's called. What I care about is that.
So we hear that word, and that's a potential one of literally the only legit uses of that term that I've seen on the internet, because gaslighting, at least the clinical term, is in the midst of a high control relationship, and it would look like this. And the way Mildred was acting with Aussie, and we saw Aussie present behaviors later where you're like, oh, well, maybe Mildred had a point, but the way Mildred was communicating about it was particular, right? Very sure of herself. And then when Mildred and Tiff were having their conversations, their conflicts, there was also there's a certainty to it. And that is a marker of an abusive individual. And the way Tiff approaches it, there were several moments even here, I don't know if I showed the clip necessarily, where Tiff is trying to defend, and then but Mildred's just on this bulldozer, and eventually Tiff just okay, fine, okay, because Mildred is not saying it directly, but is saying, you have no power, shut up. You're now going to listen to me, and you either have to act like you agree or you have to agree with me. That's the only way this bulldozer is going to stop. Tiff presents in a way that is not that. Tiff is trying to defend, but then eventually, because there is no point to pushing back, Tiff knows that, seemingly, at least the way that it looks, that you just have to give in. There's no flexibility. And the onslaught of accusations and the direction of the conversation, you have no control over it. Because one of the things that abusive people will utilize, whether they know it or not, is that non-abusive individuals, or shall we say reasonably healthy communicators, when we enter into a conversation, even if it's a conflict, there's this expectation that there's some flexibility to both people. Maybe not a lot, but there's some ability to, when you say something, that it will be considered at least kind of, right? That when you put words out into the room, that they exist and they have to be dealt with one way or the other. To abusive people, they are not like that. They don't enter into a conversation. We saw this very poignantly with Amaranth and her husband. There's not, if you're a victim or you were a victim, it's important that you know that a classic abuser, and not every abuser is the same, but a classic abuser in this way, when you're trying to work something out, when they're in that abusive mode, there is literally nothing that you can do to get them away from where they're headed. It's like they have, what's that one Marvel X-Men, the Juggernaut or something? Once that thing starts moving, it's just going to keep going. And the abuser counts on the victim staying engaged and trying to defend themselves or trying to convince. And that attempt, that more reasonable attempt, is utilized by the abuser to keep in contact. The only way to stop because often, the victim, you're trying to stop something. It's like, no, you have the wrong idea, or stop doing this to me, or you have to understand. But the only way to get that juggernaut to stop coming at you is to literally just walk away. It's not the best answer, but it's often the only answer. But for abusive people, they won't let you do that, because that'll really trigger them. Then they'll really come after you. And this is why you need a support system, you need treatment, you need advocates, you might even need the police involved, this sort of thing, because there's no safe answer to dealing with an abusive individual, because they have a lot of tools available to them to keep you engaged, to break you down, to make you feel unsafe, to threaten you. It's weird how abusive people can make you as a victim feel like the safest road is to succumb. The safest road is to let the abuse happen. If you try to end the abuse or to get away from the abuse increases. So paradoxically, the safest place, it'd sort of be like if this forest fire was coming toward you and you are, you can't breathe and you're like, oh, I got to get away from the fire. And you see it coming and you start running away from the fire or parallel to where you see the fire coming from. And then immediately fires just erupt in that direction that are even worse. You're like, whoa, I better run back. And you're running back. Well, it's like, well, but here comes the fire. Like, okay, go the other way. Fire eruption. Okay, I'll go this way. I'll try to go dig underneath. Every direction that you try to run, it's even worse. So you just give up and you sit there, well, it's going to happen. So I'll just be burned. It's that original burning, that original fire that was coming at me. There's no point in trying to get away. It's worse for me if I try to get to safety. And over time, you give up because you start to believe it's your fault. Because the other thing is, as the abuse is happening to you, if you believe that you don't deserve it and that what is happening to you is wrong, it causes you to feel hurt and angry about it. And even if you don't communicate it, it'll be detected and that'll be abused. And so eventually you suppress that and you say, I'm not being abused and I deserve it. This is right. I can't believe how loving this person is to me. That's the insidiousness of abuse. I'm not saying anything that's happening here, but there's a possibility that Tiff is still trying to transition out and because Tiff is engaged. You see that. If this is an abusive relationship, this all applies. But if it's not, then we're seeing something else. We're just seeing them fight after breaking up. Okay, well, that does it for that episode. Everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.